So you have this like massive, like complex system, and there are many decision-making points. Where are you going to intervene? There was, I think, still a need to become discreet and focused about which decision makers and which levers are you going to push, where are you going to focus.
My guest today is Danielle Droitsch, a friend and colleague I've known for many years. Danielle has worked in both the U.S. and Canadian conservation communities for over 3 decades, including the International Boreal Conservation Campaign, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Bow Riverkeeper, and more. She's founded 2 nonprofits focused on watershed protection and has helped philanthropic and conservation organizations with international campaigns for protection of major wilderness areas. In addition to her consulting work, she is an executive coach for leaders in the nonprofit community in both the U.S. and Canada. I wanted to talk to Danielle because she's got a terrific understanding of campaigns, she's worked on some complex ones with multiple decision makers and big coalitions, and because she's a delight to talk to. Danielle, welcome to the Campaign Strategist. I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you for making time.
Yeah, I'm so happy.
Awesome. How did you get started in environmental advocacy work?
Back at college, I was a history major, and I wasn't really particularly aware of the environmental issues, and I was invited to a conference. I went to the conference and I just sort of woke up. I came back from the conference and we decided to protest Exxon. That was our big ask. And so I don't even remember what we were actually, it was something.
What year was it?
Oh, this is back in 89 or something like that.
It would have to have been the Exxon Valdez, right?
Might have been, yeah. I wish I could go back because I'm still friends with all of the same people. We were in this group called Earth, and Earth was the group that I became super deeply familiar. Like those are my people, and I'm still really good friends with them. We got really involved in something protesting around that. The thing that I remember the most about what we did back in college was we had those disposable plastic cups, our dining hall, and there was many thousands of them. Then people would often grab their plates and they would put their trays, and they put 10 cups on their tray for one meal. And I remember this because everybody would walk around with 10 cups filled with various different substances, and nothing was fertile. And so we at Earth, our mighty group, which still exists today as far as I know, decided to collect all of the cups from the dining hall from a week, which was unbelievable amount of waste. And then we created art sculptures from those cups. And then we put them on the main, right? Anyway, so it's got this more main area. And then we tried to sell reusable mugs. And then we eventually were able to get the university to get away from this practice. But I remember I became very passionate about the disposable cups. It was everything I thought about and did. And that was the beginning. And then the rest is history.
You've run and participated in a whole bunch of different campaigns over the years. And this is a show where we dig into how do you go about figuring out what your campaign is going to do? What are your strategies? But I want to start with a lot of people have different ways of defining what a campaign is. And I just wanted to ask, what's your definition?
It's really about that discrete, a very defined focus of change that is mobilized by a group of people. And then I would add the piece around power mapping. Basically, just what often doesn't happen is we skip over this really essential piece. And I've been involved with so many campaigns, and people are focusing on a change that haven't even figured out the change itself. They have no idea what that change ought to be. They know it generally, but they don't know if it's a policy change or a political change or a human behavior change or whatever it is. So that's problem number one. But if you overcome that, then you still have to figure out the campaign actually has to define how are we going to get it done, and you do it through a sort of power mapping exercise.
That's the next big thing is, so what is your process when you are starting a campaign or working with groups to figure out what are we going to do to get the outcome we want? What's your process? What are the major steps involved in doing that? You mentioned power mapping.
Yeah, and even before power mapping, I think where I've noticed falling apart of campaigns is around not being discreet about that change and what needs to be changed. And sometimes there's different ways to create change. Like
Yep.
sometimes it's a corporate campaign and you change how the money flows, or sometimes it's a government change. And of course, we're in a now Trump 2.0. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Right now. And all the discussions around federal change, we're going to have a different conversation because you can try, but you'll probably fail. So, what I often, and I'm actually working with a couple of organizations now just on this kind of stuff, which is just really getting the right information on the table about the problem
Yeah.
and who can change the problem. And in one particular campaign, there's actually a lot of people involved, and there's a lot of people who have different ideas about what could change. That there could be a focus on the corporation, there could be a focus on the government. There's definitely a state change that could be made versus a federal change. And so, what often happens is people are talking about the problem, and they slide right over the fact that you kind of need to make some decisions about where you're going to focus your time. And sometimes you need some time to work through it because there are different pathways
Right.
available.
Yeah, I think a lot of times people know what they want and what they want it to look like, but figuring out what are the actual discrete mechanisms. There's always a lever or multiple levers somewhere that if you can figure out how you pull them, you are getting the change you want. That can be one of the really challenging parts of campaign planning, is to figure out what are those discrete actions that need to happen.
The oil developments in Canada, there were a lot, there still are a lot of decision makers that can affect how much of that can be unpacked. I was one of the decision makers to figure out what the strategy would be. I came in later. So that had already been decided, but there were many decision makers. There are the government decision makers in Canada. There are the oil companies that extract the oil. There are the companies that transport the oil. There are the refineries at the very other end that are refining this heavy
Yeah.
oil. And then there are the consumers, right? And then there's the US government who is facilitating this whole purchase because it's like a trade relationship. So you have this like massive, like complex system, and there are many decision-making points where you're going to intervene. There was, I think, still a need to become discreet and focused about which decision makers and which levers are you going to push, where are you going to focus, because I'm sure you've been part of these campaigns too, where you are like spinning your wheels, where people are just like coming up with 50 different actions and they're all going after different decision makers. You've really not moved the needle at all because you weren't focused. You didn't get clear up front. So it may not be just one decision maker and one decision. That's okay. More than one, but it's simply being really clear where you're going to focus your time. I coach people in the environmental sector. I'm coaching the campaigners, and they're overwhelmed. Like they're like drowning in the work. These are people who are on the ground trying to fight these big behemoth things. And what we often notice is the total burnout. So we really want to work smarter. And I feel like my big learning in my decades of doing this is to stop spinning wheels and focusing on everything. Focus, focus, focus.
You figure out what it is you want, what's the change, what's the decision that needs to be made, and then who's got control over that decision, who can make the decision to give you what you want. And then how do you approach getting them to do it?
The power and this is really where you might end up going back to your original decisions, because I know I've been in a few campaign rooms where you identify the pathway and then someone might have done some really good work to say, yeah, you could totally do this, but you're going to. I've been on both sides of the equation where I bring the starry-eyed approach and people say, you're never going to get that done. I've also been at the other end where I'm pushing and I actually get the thing done that no one thought could be done. But so sometimes you can dream, but it's really important to evaluate, can you move that decision maker forward? And maybe you can't. Maybe it's just not worth all the work and energy it would take to move when you could maybe pick a different lever. And it ultimately comes down to things that we talk about every day, politics. or not always politics. Sometimes it's a government decision maker and they're never going to go with this because they couldn't possibly make that decision because they're so allied with the Republicans or whatever. The reason you want to do that detailed look is because sometimes, and certainly I've been involved with some corporate campaigns where they will say the corporation will never change. They'll never change their mind. But then if the consumers actually speak up enough, or the people that they serve, their stakeholders, change their mind, then you may actually be able to change a corporation's mind because of the big one is social license. They're losing social license because they don't look great. Ultimately, what I've realized over the years is that sometimes you can really move the needle with these decision makers if you have the right capacity. When I was able to work with NRDC, it was beautiful because we had capacity to actually deliver campaigns that I'd never been able to deliver when I worked at the state level. So I think we have to really think about capacity. Do we have the ability to build, to throw what we need at this thing for not just a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but likely a couple of years, if not a decade? And then if the answer is yes, then yes, go and proceed. And you can maybe make big things happen. But if you can't, then, and many of the groups that I know I've worked with and you work with don't have a lot of resources. And so then you have to become super, super smart about what you can do. And small groups can make big things happen. I've certainly done it in my career, and it wasn't with the type of resources NRDC had, but it was with very smart planning.
So you identify a decision maker, you figure out what are the things that may motivate them. With politicians, it generally comes back to either a threat or a promise around them getting elected again. And usually they don't want to offend key voter blocks. So if you can mobilize key voter blocks and really get their voices through, you can have a lot of influence. What about when it's a CEO or even government aid? Like for the KXL campaign, you had to work on not just the White House and members of Congress, but you also had to advocate at EPA and the State Department, and then there were Canadian agencies. So how do you go about figuring out what's going to get the decisions you want out of those kinds of entities where it's not electoral? What you mentioned for corporations, essentially, if you can create a bigger threat that, by not doing what you're asking them, they're going to end up with bigger costs, presumably in the case, for example, if consumers stop buying their products out of protest, but maybe there's other forms. How do you figure out what's going to move these other kinds of decision makers?
So I'm going to back into this by talking about the t-shirt problem.
Totally. Okay.
And maybe some of your listeners will remember this kind of challenge, or maybe it was just me, but sometimes we have this big problem. We have all these, decision makers, and somebody says, let's sell t-shirts.
Yeah.
Let's sell t-shirts. Or it may not be that. It might be, let's have a protest.
Right.
Or it might be, let's start a social media campaign. And everybody's like, yeah. So I have here in my house literally dozens of my campaign t-shirts from all the years that I've been a campaigner because we had to make the t-shirt. It was so crucial. And somebody got really excited and we focused on the design and which t-shirt company. This is the trap, right? The trap is we just need to mobilize. We need to mobilize. And I am a big believer in mobilization. I love going to my protests and showing up with my placard, just like anyone else. But it's a real pitfall. It's a pitfall of our sector because we want to just get together and we think if we just make a noise and we make it loud enough, then people will hear us. Guess what? They are not. There's a tool in the toolbox and you pick it up. The most effective campaigns I've been part of, and people have seen the big protests from KXL, but I would say the big campaigns were the most important tools. They were great. They were important. And I know Obama heard it, but I do not think those were the most important tools in the toolbox. So now I'm backing into the answering your question, which is campaign planning, like having the time to sit down, and we skip over it. It's unbelievable how often we skip over sitting down, and you may have to sit down again and again and lap it out, ideally on a whiteboard. If you're on Zoom, you can use app tools or whatever. But the idea is to look at each and every one. So if we go to the Keystone campaign, yeah, the White House was the target, but for a long period of time, the White House wasn't paying attention to this at all. It was not on their radar. It wasn't important. And so really it was about who does the White House listen to? We mapped that out. I mean, yes, they did listen to the climate groups, but if we had just stopped there, we would have lost. Well, we really had to think, who are they listening to? And so we mapped that out and included the agencies like the EPA, and there was different agencies that were providing input into that decision, State Department of Energy. But then also there were constituencies. And this is probably one of the biggest learnings I've had in the past, sort of 10 or 15 years of my campaign career is not the environmental sector. Get away, just not always the environmental sector. So who cares about this issue? There was unions that weren't with us, but unions that we were able to engage and that were able to join us with. So this sort of idea of diverse coalitions or indigenous peoples like tribes were part of this. And then of course, out in the states where Keystone would have been built, it would have been the cowboys. And the agricultural community where the pipeline was going to be built and was going to potentially ruin their water supply. So this idea of who are those people and how could they influence? And honestly, when you do that power mapping, you do come up with a million possible choices, and that's the tough part. Then you really get into the overwhelm of possibility. But if you pick and choose the ones that you think, okay, if we put our attention on these 25 actions, that should move the needle. Whereas when we don't have that conversation, people just start throwing spaghetti at the wall, and they do the protests and they buy the t-shirts and they create tremendous amount. Like they might have delivered hundreds of thousands of petitions and they didn't do the hard work. Sometimes it's one conversation between two people that makes that difference. It doesn't have to be a behemoth number of people. It can be literally one letter to another person that can make the thing happen that you need.
You mentioned petitions. That's my sort of version of the t-shirts, which is a lot of times people, let's have a petition. They can be useful, but every tool has a particular use and works in particular situations. Like you can't use a hammer to drive a screw into a wall. I mean, you can, but it's not going to come out the way you want. And with petitions, if you start an environmental petition and just circulate it out there, you'll get a whole bunch of signatories from California and Vermont and New York. But what if your target doesn't represent any of those particular states and they're not swing states? It's not going to have very much leverage. So figuring out how to mobilize the voices that are going to matter. The Campaign for the Clean Power Plan, one of the things that we had to do to give the Obama White House confidence with moving forward with this bold, never before used authority under the EPA was some assurance that it wouldn't cost them control of the Senate with the midterms coming up. And so we focused the comment drive, which is effectively basically petition gathering, in key states where there were Senate races that they were worried about so that we could show there is a ton of support for this issue in these places. You don't have to worry. And that made a tremendous difference. What are they worried about? What's going to move them? What are they keeping an eye on? With what you can do really makes a huge difference.
That's so brilliant, because what you're getting at here is you're thinking about the decision maker. You're really thinking,
Yes.
and I know that NODC, I feel like we did a lot, really, and we also were able to talk to the decision makers and say, what's your perspective? And it's something we want to do is talk to the decision maker, just listen. What are they concerned about? What is their, think about how often people don't even think to talk to the decision maker, like all the time. It's really and I'm not saying, I would say that early in my career, I wouldn't have. I would have just spent all my time creating a whole bunch of energy.
Yep.
Not having had one conversation. And then later, when you finally talk to them, you're like, oh my gosh, like they're totally concerned about this thing. I could have addressed that. So talk to the decision maker, set up a meeting, whatever you have to do. It's not always, I'm not saying you could meet the president of the United States, but you could certainly try to get intelligence. It's brilliant to really think about how you're going to deploy something like a petition in order to have it speak to your decision maker.
You mentioned another thing, and you've done a lot of coalition management and big coalitions. And that's something I think is often a challenge as well in campaigns, because coalitions, even when you all are on the same side and want the same thing, they can be very unruly. Hopefully you can get them to agree on who the decision makers are. How do you get them to agree on the strategies? How do you get them to agree on a communications framework and the narrative? Talk a little bit about that from your experience, because you've had to do this kind of thing both internally within a large organization of basically shepherding a lot of cats to go in the same direction, and externally with big groups like during the KXL campaign. So what's that like, and how do you find ways to do that effectively?
If there was like a secret sauce for me, that's my, again, lawyer that sort of became stronger in the personality space. Like, it's really relationships, right? And so it is sort of where I feel like I'm strongest, is that idea of bringing people together to work on a common purpose. And everybody sort of agrees in the problem. Usually when you're bringing people together, there's usually agreement around the problem. But then kind of just stops there, especially if you're building a diverse campaign, which you want. You want a diverse group of people that are all together working toward the same solution. And the more diverse you get, the more diversity of opinion and perspective. KXL was one of those, but I've also worked with camp coalitions. And I'm going to talk here in a second about the word coalition briefly, but that are international in nature, in the sense of a group of organizations and tribes and First Nations and academics that all were and still are trying to address the proliferation of mines on the US and Canadian border. And that was, and it continues on, but when I was running that, that was also another example. Number one is, what is the nature of that agreement or between the groups? And so the word coalition, to me, I don't know, for you, I'd really be curious, is like a coalition is usually something very formal where people sign on to something. And one of my first coalitions that I ran, it's a group now called the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. It wasn't that at the time. It was called the Tennessee Valley Energy Reform Coalition, which is a total mouthful. River coalition across 7 states. And my job, fresh out of college, was to facilitate the coalition, which was fun. But I remember I was being thrown into really thrown into the fire. It's here are all these organizations come together to figure out a way to reform the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a very pro-nuclear and pro-coal. They weren't doing anything in the clean energy space. So that's a formalized coalition because we had a statement. People signed on to it, and that we had one member for our board represented each person. But I will say that I don't see as many coalitions as I do just collaborations. And that might be because the whole idea of signing a piece of paper and, you have to everyone agree. I mean, I know there are coalitions out there, and sometimes people are kicked out of coalitions because they can't agree or whatever. I think the model, at least from where I sit, has been more collaborations where people come together and they agree to collaborate, but they're not necessarily signing a document. The pro of that is that it's more flexible. People can add in what they want to contribute, and they don't have to necessarily all sign some document that they may not agree to. That's the pro. The negative is that sometimes everybody's not remembering what they're fighting for at the same time, or there's a disagreement about strategy, or some groups put in a ton of resources and others are not putting in resources, and it creates tension. My personal view of this is that you absolutely need campaign. You need people at the center who are staffing that up. That their job is to staff the collaboration, the coalition, the coordination, whatever it looks like. Because if you don't, then things will fall apart. Because there always are tensions, whatever that tension may be about. But the beauty of bringing multiple groups together, and they don't have to always sit on the same calls. They don't have to necessarily always be on the same press releases or anything. To me, that's almost restrictive. But you need someone, at least one person, who is their entire job is to worry about all the members and building individual relationships with each one, knowing where everybody stands and how each one is appreciated, making sure that their input is woven in and considered. And if it's not included, why? Why did we not follow your ideas? And that's the role I've played on many campaigns over the years. And it's I've failed more than I'd like to admit on this podcast on campaign and coalition management. But once you get that down, then what happens is you unearth this incredible power of which is really the mobilization of people. But we often don't staff that up because it's like, oh, that's just this internal role. Let's just have the campaign, whatever. When you put people together in a group, the research shows that groups make terrible decisions. By and large, groups make terrible decisions, which is not a surprise. So why do we just somehow expect throwing a whole bunch of people into a room together and suddenly they're going to make a better decision? And so now there's a lot of people that have made their professional careers. I'm one of them, around how do you bring groups together to make good decisions? Because we think, oh, if more people come into a room, it'd be a better decision. What happens is because of tensions, conflict, behavioral styles, all sorts of things, what happens is that group decision is worse than if one person made that decision.
That's probably why a lot of campaigns are hierarchical. There's always a balancing because this is where there's so much art involved as well as sciences. And I have yet to achieve coalition management as good as I know in theory it could be, because it's really hard. It's really time consuming and lots of shuttle diplomacy where you've got to always be going back and forth, as you said, to know what's driving people, what are their capacities, what can they throw into the fight, what's causing them concern, where are the tensions, how do you either solve them or skirt them? You really got my curiosity. What have you found about how do you get groups to make good decisions? Is it just lots and lots of back and forthing, is there more to it?
I don't know if you would agree with this, but I feel like we tend to throw us all together, and now it's more on Zoom chats than it is into a room. And we tend to throw ourselves into a room together and hope we figure it out in that room.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've evolved my thinking about that. Maybe because I've become a coach in the last decade of my life. I'm really interested in how humans tick and how they think and how they behave. I really spend a lot of time trying to understand people. And I've just learned how people think. And they're so different in how they think and how they do. And it's not just an extrovert-introvert issue. In fact, I don't even really accept that sort of dichotomy because I think you can be an extrovert and an introvert at the same time. But it's more that the way you can bring your best self to anything is really diverse and very different. And so we will tend, in general, if we have meetings with a whole bunch of people in a room, that will tend to serve a certain type of person with a certain type of strengths. And that's fine. But what it means is we've left a whole bunch of talent on the table. My experience has been that it is fun to get into a campaign strategy session and have that ideation and sort of imagine. But when it comes down to things like choosing strategy and figuring out what are the tactics, sometimes it's actually partly to bring people together, but partly to allow people to weigh in a different way. So I'll go back to that campaign that I worked on, the international one on the proliferation of mines in the transboundary region between Canada and the US, mostly focused on Alaska, Montana, Idaho, and Washington State. We had a lot of tribes that were involved in that. And the tribes, understandably, didn't want to show up to our campaign calls. They were very busy with their own stuff.
Yep.
It was like, no, you don't need to make to our campaign calls. So my job was to either talk to them directly myself or have some of the people who really had the strong relationships talk to them. And of course, they had incredible wisdom. They had first of all, they had incredible power to make change. And they also had really good ideas about what they were going to do. And they also were decision makers in the sense of, we're not going to come to them and say, hey, tribe, this is what you should do. Add your voice to the campaign. We have this idea for you to run a position, for example. That wasn't looking at how it's going to happen. So we needed to be able to tap into their ideas, their wisdom, their concerns in a way that would add value. And it required getting in a car and driving to where they lived and spending days with them. It also was about talking to elders in addition to the electeds. Essentially, it was not about a big meeting. It was really about how do you harness the collective talent. And the reason to do that is not just because you have a better campaign plan, which you will, but then people really plug in. What you don't want is half of your coalition or your collaboration to be engaged. And then the other half are listed as participating, but they're really not. What happens is you have like a couple of groups that are doing everything, and then you have a bunch of groups that are doing nothing. I'm not saying there's an easy answer, because sometimes they're overwhelmed, like the organization, and you can't do anything about it. Ultimately, what we do know is that when you bring people's talents in and when you engage their talent, they're going to engage more. They're just going to engage more. So you got to figure out, what is their talent? What are they good at? What do they want to do? And then plug them in that way. And then you have more engagement because they've been heard and they're deploying themselves in that way.
One of the things that's on any organization's mind in these kinds of settings is they're thinking about, or the individual representing the organization is thinking about, what's my boss going to say about what I'm committing us to or what I'm proposing? And what are my group's strengths? What are we good at? And where does that fit in with this? I was just thinking, as you were talking about, you don't go to partners with prescribed tactics that you want them to do, but does it help to think about it in terms of talking to the organizations about, okay, look, for the thing we want to have happen, these are the people that we need to influence. These are the decision makers. I want to talk to you about, what capacity do you have to help move that? I don't have like a concrete example in mind, but my instinct and experience is that opens you up to a variety of strategies and voices that otherwise you might never even have thought of before, because you're giving that group, then they're thinking about, what are all of our relationships? Who are the leaders that we work with strewn throughout the, like you might just find at a church, some of the church leaders, siblings to the elected officials in that area, or whatever, their biggest customer, or whatever, some kind of relationship that you might not otherwise discover, that you're triggering those groups to think about, instead of just saying, here, check this box there.
Yeah. And you do need to have that open conversation. You have to have space for each group to be able to, first of all, get on the same page. This is the decision we're focused on, going back to the beginning of the conversation we've had. Here are the decision makers. And then what could you do? Because I fall prey to this as much as anyone else. We just fall back into the same patterns of the toolbox that we go to as a campaigner. And sometimes we do that because we don't know what else to do, right? It's like the petition or the protest or the sign-on letter, the famous sign-on letter. I think about all the sign-on letters. I can't imagine. I get literally like dozens and dozens of sign-on letters and spending hours and hours trying to get the words just right. And then knowing that no one's going to read the letter. So those are good. We want to do those, but we often aren't creative, because you just hit on what I think is one of the most important things that we forget, is that decision makers are human beings and they have these other relationships. And I know you have experiences or examples, and I do too, where it really was a conversation that actually changed the trajectory. It wasn't the big protest that actually changed it. It was, those helped. Those created good energy.
Right, exactly.
But the change of a decision to go in a different direction, which is usually what we want to do in our lives, is we want to change the direction of a decision. Somebody had a conversation with someone else, or there was a series of conversations. And I've heard about these. Like, people reported to me, oh, Governor such and so talked to Governor such and so, and he's going to do something different. And I'm like, holy crap, how did that happen? But we often don't get into that kind of detail because we think it's too small. We think it's like, I'm only going to talk to this one person. I now know, after many years, to treat every single opportunity to influence a decision maker, whether it's an individual, a friend, a family member, or even something different, like a different constituency that they listen to, even generating one letter from the one constituency they actually listen to. And that might take you 50 hours to get that letter, and it might be still okay, because that letter is going to be worth its weight in gold.
Yeah.
You have to do the analysis, but I feel like over the years, I've really pulled back from the big, loud campaigns to something that's quieter and can make things change.
More surgical strikes. That's a great place to wind down on. What is some advice you got from a mentor or colleague that influenced you and that you want to share?
I think it goes back to something. I have a lot of mentors, but I'll mention my NRDC mentors, Liz Bear Brown and Susan Casey Lefkowitz, who both really were extraordinary influences in my life, still are. The most important thing is their focus. They just work so laser focused and always bringing us back. And I would probably be someone in the room to say, let's do this thing. And they were like, let's focus. Yeah, I think it really made the difference, and they trained me well.
the discipline of asking, does that align with what we're trying to do? And does that contribute to the person we're trying to move? Yeah, I have the same struggle. And then is there something that you know now that you wish you'd known a lot sooner?
Well, I would say people is not to ignore the people that can make a difference. And if I could say something like right now, we're completely can't believe that we're facing Trump 2.0 right now. And yet I know I live in Utah. I live in a very red state, and I have people I'm friends with who are Trump voters.
Yeah.
And I like them. They're really nice people. I don't understand why they voted the way they did. And we just really have to be careful about leaving behind people that we can't work with. It's a tricky one. It's really hard. But people do share values and for clean water, clean air, healthy communities, and they don't write them off.
That's great. That's a great note to end on, and one as we look ahead to the next few years. So, Danielle, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This has been terrific and lots of fun.
Thank you so much, Pete.
Thanks for tuning into the Campaign Strategist, where we dive into the art and science of advocacy. The podcast is produced by Prismatic Strategies to share wisdom and insights from leaders in the field. I'm your host, Pete Altman. Music was written by Andrea Perry and Pete Altman, and this is edited by Abby Altman. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who care about making a difference. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. Thanks again, and see you next time.